What does the learning process look like? Because I know you did at least two boot camps, right? One was for marketing, one was for software engineering. At some point, you learned design as well. So, how was the process of learning all of those things? And then also the transition from you're like walking into work every day with a suit. Someone is giving you your assignments. Now you have to manage yourself. You also have like a whole lot of stuff to learn. What was the transition like?
So the learning was at least so the launch school was the majority of my learning, and that was a formal thing. It's an online, it's a boot camp, but it's online, and so I was, going to the office every day, like you mentioned, and just sort of sitting down and going through their curriculum. That was the majority. I mean, the vast majority of the like official formal learning. Uh, that was fine. I felt especially right after right after I left State Street, the very next day I went to my new office and was not in the suit, was not in that felt wonderful. Just being able to like get to have your coffee and like not that I ever felt like, oh guys, my managers are looking for me. When am I coming in? Of course, that never really existed, but it was still kind of nice to just like here I am, like I'm doing what I want, like I can, I'm gonna go to lunch when I want, I'm gonna leave when I want. Like there was definitely a nice sense of kind of like accomplishment, even though I had done nothing yet other than quit. Like whoop de hoo, like how important. But like it was still like having made that decision felt very good in the beginning. And first very in the very beginning, I wasn't yet trying to build a business. I was just learning, so there was no like financial pressures at that time and all that sort of stuff. So that was quite easy. The marketing side, so the General Assembly here in Hong Kong had a 12-week boot camp, and that was like, I think it was once or twice a week for a couple hours. It'd go at night, and you'd learn some of the broad themes of marketing. And this was really extremely high level, and I think afterwards I've actually found online videos or other resources that I think were more useful, but it was still good to get a lay of the land. Like, I had no idea that of the different channel types: paid, earned, owned, the different, the main paid channels, Google and Facebook, are actually very different. They have very different intent and all that. Like, it was good to get a broad overview of that stuff, but not because I could really take much action on what I learned there, but it like helped me understand later on like the areas I wanted to focus on and learn a lot more on. Um, yeah.
If you had to go back now, so how long have you been working on Hack Chinese at this point, from start to now?
From actually writing the first line of code,
Correct.
uh,
Yeah,
3 years. Yeah.
3 years. If you had to look back on this, would you have changed the way you learned anything, whether it be what you decided to learn, how you learned it, the mix of things you learned? Anything you'd change about that?
If you ask that same question about the business trajectory and decisions I've made there, I would say a ton of stuff. But in terms of the learning, I I actually think I did it in a way that suits me and was quite useful. So learning, I certainly did not need to learn as much up front. I could have had a much more focused 12-week boot camp somewhere and learned to like, okay, write a small Rails app. And I think that probably maybe that would have gotten me off the ground faster. I would have gone from zero to something a little bit faster. But taking the time to really like know enough about like I learned quite a lot about databases. I learned quite a lot about like HTML and the DOM, and like yeah, you can do like a 4 hour course on HTML and the DOM, and that'll be fine. But that only means you're postponing some of that learning until later, because then you have to then you realize like, okay, well, what about like the canvas, and how does jQuery interact with it, and like how do all these other frameworks change things in the DOM, and like what is the HTTP cycle between the server and the client and all that sort of stuff. Like you don't need to learn all of that stuff right at once. You can have a more targeted approach and just sort of like build an app, which I think is the more common accepted way that people think you should do that. And for many people, maybe that is if you're really pressed for time, I guess. But for me, getting that broad understanding meant that later on, whenever I had any sort of like issue or trouble where I had some problem to solve, I may not know how to solve that, but I had like a really good framework of like understanding all the stuff around it. So I like knew where to look. I knew what types of questions to ask. I knew like I could narrow down the problem of like, oh, this is not working and it can be one of three or four things. That came from this really like broad understanding that came from this more like mastery based curriculum. Sounds like an ad for launch school now, but for me that was the right thing to do. I had the luxury of a little bit of extra time I could spend on it, but going slow in the beginning I think sped me up in the end. So I would say technically that was the right path for me.